Angela Rayner wants to be the alpha number two, the alpha female in the government, the leader in waiting, and I don't think it will upset her too much that Rachel Reeves has been put in her place a little bit in the last few days.
Tim, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV, and I'm going to hold out your cover to the audience. It's claws out.
Another bit of art.
Another bit of art. This is your second cover.
Yes. Very exciting.
How is your career going at The Spectator so far?
Well, I'm still being employed, so that's good. After 3 weeks, no, that's good. I'm enjoying it hugely. It's a great platform. I've been reading The Spectator for 30 years, and I've contributed to it on and off for about 10, under a couple of editors, and it's wonderful. And I never get bored of seeing my stuff in The Spectator, and now to be doing that every week is a real pleasure.
And to have all of these designs. So
exactly.
Starting this week with Labour's first year, and the week has ended with tears from the Chancellor and a huge rebellion.
Yep.
Is it really that bad for Starmer? I mean, he's got a shallow majority, things are fine. Is this as bad as it was in the first 100 days, would you say?
I would say it's probably worse, actually, because I think in the first 100 days, they got a lot wrong, some of which was through inexperience and getting the wrong people in place. And in a sense, while Starmer can shake up his team and change his cabinet and do all that sort of thing, they're making mistakes now and having problems now for stuff that is going to be much more difficult to solve. And so the piece I wrote kind of divides the year into three. Phase one is sort of Sue Gray and, the wrong person running the show to start with, who didn't know how to plan for a government. So a lot of what went wrong at the beginning was, simply not preparing, not having a plan for the first 100 days. Then Morgan McSweeney comes in and kind of imposes a bunch of discipline, gets Starmer to respond to what the public actually thinks about immigration and welfare to a degree. It looked like a sort of professionalisation and pragmatism taking over. And then, as one of my sources put it, part three is things fall apart. And what's happened is that the left of the Labour Party has sensed weakness in a Prime Minister who doesn't seem to have a kind of clear guiding light for what he's trying to do. And they've sensed weakness. They've found that, even with a huge majority, a bunch of MPs don't have a great deal to do, or they're looking over their shoulder and thinking, well, reform might take our seats at the next election. I didn't come here just for 4 or 5 years to start doing all these terrible things that I'm being asked to do. And I don't really understand economics, and I don't really understand what the problem would be if we just spent 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 billion more pounds here. So why don't we do that? It'll make me feel better. It might make my constituents feel better. And it's not necessarily wrong to reverse what happened on winter fuel. It was probably a politically inept decision to start with that didn't raise a great deal of money, and the political damage far outweighed the economic gains. But you do get to a point where if 100 MPs can just decide we don't like this very much, it doesn't matter how big your majority is, they're still capable of defeating the government. And this is a Prime Minister who spent a lot of time abroad. He's been much less adept at the domestic scene, and he is now under a great deal of pressure. And the fact that his Chancellor of the Exchequer is bursting into tears in the House of Commons, he's now had to prop her up and say she'll keep the job forever and ever and ever.
Well, yeah, they're together. They've been together this morning,
that's
hugging,
right.
Best of friends. But yesterday he refused to say that he was going to keep her in the post.
Which, politically is the sensible position to find yourself in. Now, if he's not planning to fire her until at least next year, he should probably have just propped her up resolutely at Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday. But having had, sort of Teargate, he's felt that he's had to sort of, circle his arms around Rachel Reeves, both literally and metaphorically. There's been a lot of hugging the morning after, and now he's stuck with her. You get rid of your Chancellor. It's quite difficult to get rid of your Chancellor and keep your job as Prime Minister, as lots of Prime Ministers have discovered over the years. But Margaret Thatcher managed to move on from Geoffrey Howe and get Nigel Lawson in, and that, the problem Starmer's got is that whoever he brought in instead of Rachel Reeves would, because of pressure in his own party, have to move to the left, borrow more, spend more, tax more. And that is not what the markets want this government to be doing, and it's probably not what all voters want to see. I mean, some clearly would, but is that going to be more popular? And the sooner the markets lose their confidence in a government, then borrowing gets much more expensive and things can spiral downwards pretty fast. So I think the situation he's in now, partly through external events, difficulties with the world economy, partly through a lot of his party not really being grown up enough to govern properly, and partly through his own mistakes and his personnel decisions, he's in a bit of a mess, really.
Morgan McSweeney, to the Westminster bubble, is a very well-known character, and in your little cartoon, he is the one being wrapped around by the snake. Who is he? And do you think it would be fair to say he's the Dominic Cummings of Labour?
I suspect both McSweeney and Cummings would regard that comparison as a double-edged sword. Actually, they've got a lot of respect for each other, and there's some interesting points where they agree, and I think Morgan McSweeney, as Starmer's chief of staff, had only been in the job for a small handful of weeks when he was drawing quite a lot of the same conclusions that Dominic Cummings drew when he was working in Boris Johnson's Downing Street. They both think the civil service is poor at delivering for elected governments. They both think the leadership of it is too cautious. They both think that there's a kind of corporate view in the civil service that prevents sort of interesting radical things being done. Too many not very able people are promoted, often to get them out of where they're causing trouble, but they get a promotion to a different job. Both wanted to bring in more outsiders into government. I think they're both enthusiasts for tech. Cummings, in a lot of what he's written and said, will tell you that he had to completely overhaul Downing Street when COVID struck. They didn't even have Google Docs in number 10 at the start of the Boris Johnson premiership. People were emailing Word files to each other. There was certainly no data operation. Cummings overhauled all that. And to a degree, that got sort of put on the back burner under Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. McSweeney made it known quite early on in his time as chief of staff that he'd brought back something called 10DS, which is a bunch of sort of tech experts inside Downing Street, which had been set up by Cummings. Now, you mentioned Cummings to a lot of Labour people, and they'll think that he's the devil incarnate. The interesting thing is that an increasing number of people on the left of the Labour Party regard Morgan McSweeney as the devil incarnate too.
Maybe they should hang out.
Well, I mean, one of my dearest wishes for Spectator readers is that we get the pair of them in a room together and we listen to what they say, because where they agree and where they disagree would be fascinating. One of them has agreed to do that. The other one is a bit more cautious, but has not ruled it out. So watch this space. I will try and make this happen because I think it'd be very interesting. Both of them have become became or have become lightning rods for their leaders. People who don't like the leader, going back hundreds of thousands of years, have criticised the aides. You go back to the Duke of Buckingham or the Dispensers or Piers Gaveston. These were all overmighty aides who were regarded as someone that the MPs could have a pop at. Tory MPs loathed Dominic Cummings and blamed him for a lot of the stuff that Boris Johnson did. Only by the time Cummings had gone 2 years later, Johnson was unprotected and was forced out himself. So I think Starmer knows that McSweeney has helped him get elected, and at Cabinet earlier this week, he basically said, we're not going to criticise our staff, certainly not our chief of staff, without whom none of us would be sitting here. But there are clearly some people who think he's steering Starmer down the wrong path, and they always find it easy to blame the aides rather than the bloke at the top. And in my experience of speaking to both men, I would say Morgan McSweeney has a clearer idea of what he's trying to do in politics than the Prime Minister does.
And you write about, in your cover piece, this leaked memo that McSweeney wrote before they went into government, and they revisited it recently, and actually he was quite prophetic in a lot of the predictions that he made. So tell me about this memo. Yeah,
this was written in May of 2024. So at the start of when they were planning to, we're expecting a general election very shortly. It's kind of 2 months before polling day. And McSweeney basically says, look, Labour governments are not terribly good at getting re-elected. Even big majorities in 1945, 1966 kind of went pear-shaped quite quickly. Only Tony Blair really has managed to sort of sustain, 3 big wins in a row. And there's a kind of cultural issue there. McSweeney would say, the Tories are born to power. The second they get in, they're trying to win again. They run a rolling campaign, whereas Labour people come in, they think they've only got a brief period, but we've got to change the world in that time. And really, if you actually want to change the world, you've got to win more than one term. He also predicted that what happens when you get a bunch of slightly self-indulgent Labour MPs with time on their hands and a huge majority, they start turning into activists and campaigners again rather than members of a governing coalition. And likely they will start to cause trouble on issues close to their heart. And that's precisely what's happened in the last week. There's some more in the memo, which I didn't have space for in the cover piece, but will probably exhume in the next few days, about how you deal with reform. He predicted that the radical sort of the populist right would be the next challenge. And how do you take on someone who's offering everything to everyone? And there's lessons in there about what they do. So my understanding is that when things started to go very badly wrong, McSweeney and the Prime Minister, I think, had a meeting on Monday of this week in which this memo was in part discussed, which is why someone thought it might be interesting to find its way to me, because it's shows that McSweeney had his head screwed on, but also points a little bit of the way forward that we might see in the next few months.
I suppose McSweeney, one of his main concerns would be that Labour get into government second time round. Could you see a world in which his next memo suggests that there should not be any more Starmer? Because there's been a series of U-turns. We're in a situation where lots of people don't know what Starmer actually believes in. And if McSweeney is the clever strategist he might be, and sort of Dominic Cummings adjacent style, like he could end up turning on his own boss.
Look, I think McSweeney has a far lesser track record of turning on people he works for than Cummings, who has basically turned on everybody he's ever worked for. He turned on Ian Duncan Smith when he was working for him in opposition. He turned on Boris Johnson pretty emphatically. Look, I think, to phrase the question slightly differently, does Morgan McSweeney sit in Downing Street and think Keir Starmer's doing the best job that he could to advance the interests of the Labour Party? I suspect not. Is he likely to write a memo saying, sorry, boss, time's up, off you go? I don't think so, for two reasons. The first is that they are kind of men belayed together on the side of a rock face, and that if one of them goes, it probably suggests the other one won't be too far behind. So I think them falling out is not the answer. They both recognise a mutual interest. McSweeney basically picked Starmer as the person most likely to be able to reform the Labour Party and get back into government, and that proved broadly correct. And I think in defending him, Starmer knows that McSweeney brings him a sort of access to what the public's thinking and a way of boiling that down that he doesn't find straightforward himself. I think the other reason is that McSweeney, has spent years fighting the hard left of the Labour Party, but also kind of bypassing the indulgences of the soft left of the Labour Party. And what would be the likely outcome of Keir Starmer leaving? I think most people in British politics, even more than the people outside, think that Angela Rayner would be the leader, hands down. There are probably more able people and more interesting people who could do the job, but she would get it sewn up very quickly. And I'm not sure that McSweeney thinks that, or a lot of other Labour strategists think she would necessarily be the future of the Labour Party that they want to see. The interesting thing is that people on the left are now dressing up their general support for sort of more left-wing policies and an admiration for Angela Rayner with two other things which will strengthen her case. The first is that they can just about now make a strategic argument that McSweeney, in being tough on immigration and Labour in attempting this welfare reform which hasn't worked, they see that as sort of hedging and aiming at reform, essentially. They would say that hasn't worked. Why are we chasing reform? We're losing all these voters to the left, to the Greens, to the Lib Dems. Now, the pragmatist faction in the Labour Party would say actually far more votes have been lost to the non-voting public, and that the way to keep those non-voters and to get them to come back is to be pragmatic and sensible on this stuff. But it's easy for the left to look at a bunch of votes heading to the Green Party and say, well, actually, we've left our left wing exposed, so might Angela Rayner be better propping that up? Then the second point is that they look at Keir Starmer and see someone who looks like a sort of competent, cautious, sensible administrator, but not an inspired politician, not someone who can drag the public kicking and screaming where he wants to go, and not someone who really has a clear direction or destination in mind. And on that basis, they can say, look at Angela Rayner. She's good in the House of Commons. She can swing her handbag at the Tories pretty effectively. She's got a bit of oomph. She could take on Feroze better than Starmer. She's got, she wouldn't take nonsense from Feroze. She'd give him a clip round the ear, and might that be? So you've got two pragmatic kind of arguments that they can now deploy alongside that kind of, we're Labour and we should be helping everybody and we can't possibly save money or have a go at anybody on benefits, even though the number of people and the cost is absolutely spiralling in a way that's kind of quite damaging, not just to the British economy, but to society as well.
Let's talk about some of the factions in Labour and start firstly, because we're talking about Rayner, that the Rayner-Reeves divide is pretty bad, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And there's some suggestions that Rayner's kind of team briefing about how she'd had to broker the peace over the welfare reforms, had intervened with both Liz Kendall and with Rachel Reeves to try and make that happen, and with the backbenchers. I think Rachel Reeves was probably quite annoyed about that. We saw a very blatant story in the Daily Telegraph a little while ago, which basically said Angela Rayner has been lobbying on tax rises and what they ought to look like, which clearly the Treasury found very unhelpful. The working assumption of most people in the Labour Party is that Rayner's team themselves leaked that, and they gave it to the Telegraph to make it look like it was somebody else, not their natural terrain. In the same way, Dominic Cummings used to give stories to the Mirror, so it didn't look like anything had leaked from, they could then blame the civil service rather than blame him. So I think there's a tension there, but there's also a tension, who's the alpha female in this government? If you go back from sort of July through to probably February, Rachel Reeves was clearly the sort of second most important person in the government after Keir Starmer. He let her get on and run domestic policy to a large degree while he went off dealing with Ukraine and Trump and all that kind of stuff. And I think while Angela Rayner is broadly keeping her head down, looking loyal, people saying cabinet that she doesn't say very much, she's not throwing her weight around. There's not a kind of really proactive Rayner campaign in the way that there was a pretty proactive generic campaign in the Conservative Party. But Angela Rayner wants to be the alpha number two, the alpha female in the government, the leader in waiting, and I don't think it will upset her too much that Rachel Reeves has been put in her place a little bit in the last few days.
No, definitely not. And then other factions, you've got the Blue Labour people. We're talking Shabana Mahmood, Jonathan Hinder, would you say? And then, well, you could probably tell me a bit more about Blue Labour, but then separately to that, and completely on the other side, you'd probably have the sort of two-child benefit rebels such as Zara Sultana.
Yeah, I mean, I'd put Zara Sultana in the kind of hard left group around the campaign group. I'm not sure whether she's actually a member of that or not, but that's, one wing. The Blue Labour crowd includes a lot of MPs like Jonathan Hinder, who are kind of won seats back in what used to be called the Red Wall, which Boris Johnson stole, and then a lot of them Labour stole back. Those people, do want to see a more pragmatic line on immigration than most metropolitan Labour people are comfortable with.
Are they probably the most afraid of reform?
Yeah, I would say so, because there are, I think, 92 seats where reform is in second place, and I think something in the 80s of those are Labour seats. Reform has already taken the chunk out of the Tories that it was going to take votes-wise. There's a lot of Labour seats which are vulnerable to reform. So those people are important. Maurice Glassman, who's the kind of godfather of Blue Labour, he and McSweeney are pretty close. I don't think McSweeney regards himself as a member of Blue Labour, but he certainly finds some of their arguments persuasive, and I think both Blue Labour and McSweeney would say that they have a more clear understanding of where your average British voter is than a lot of the traditional metropolitan Labour left. But there's a big, as ever in parties, the most important faction is the kind of soggy middle. And where is the soggy middle? If the soggy middle is where the leader is, then that's fine, if the leader can persuade people to be there with him. But there's an increasing number of Labour MPs who are not kind of confident in the leader and not confident of the direction of the government. And that just encourages them to join these clubs and these factions and go off and find some identity, join the WhatsApp groups, go to the dinners, and that, breeds problems. We saw under the Conservative Party what happens when, they had the famous 5 families on the right, every single body of opinion in the Conservative Party under the last government suddenly had a research group. It started with the ERG, the European Research Group, then there was a China one, then there was a Northern one. And if Labour falls into that sort of factional habit, and Labour, let's be blunt, does factionalism like nobody else, the left is traditionally been a sort of war zone of, and the smaller the differences between the groups, the greater and more vociferous the arguments between them.
You can only imagine the WhatsApp group names.
Yeah, and actually, there's talk of Jeremy Corbyn forming his own party and peeling off the sort of hard left. The Tories fell out, had a lot of factions, and it's a bit like the Labour Party, and then Labour wins a huge landslide on the back of the right being split, and now the left's like, no, let us split. We're the true splittists. Let us have our factions. So there's a lot of minefields ahead for Starmer as a result of all of this.
And lastly, I just want to ask you about Andy Burnham, because he's been a very vocal rebel, not an MP, but John Connolly has written a sidebar to your cover piece that, he is a leading force of the North.
The king of the North.
He's
the king in the North.
Is that an exaggeration?
No, I don't think so, because, look, during Labour's period in opposition, all they had really were some of the cities. They've managed to wrest control of Birmingham back from the Tories. They've had the London mayoralty for quite a period of time, and then Burnham was the sort of figurehead in Manchester. It's a very big job, and he probably has slightly more powers than the Mayor of London actually to do stuff. And he's done, because successive governments have seen the need to help transform the transport system and bung money to some of these key conurbations, Burnham has very cleverly milked that like mad and also used it as a platform. And the thing with Andy Burnham is, he's one of the great political insiders of our time, Cambridge educated, 3 or 4 cabinet jobs under previous Labour leaders, and then goes off and says, I'm the ultimate outsider. I'm going to run Manchester. You can guarantee that, he's a very good weather vane of how much difficulty the Labour leader of the day happens to be in. Andy Burnham just gets on with the job in Manchester, but if he doesn't like the smell of something and he thinks that the leadership is wounded, out he comes and starts parading his much more left-wing credentials than he ever did when he was in the Blair and Brown governments, where he was an absolute boilerplate, kind of pragmatist Blairite. And he seems to have been sort of rebelling against that ever since, really. And this is a guy who was cynical enough once when he was asked by, I think it was Mumsnet or somewhere like that, what's your favourite biscuit?
Oh, yes.
And he replied, pie and mash, which is fairly an astonishing attempt to sort of
come across as northern,
literally curry favour with the North.
Yeah.
And he's a tortured soul. He kind of grew up on the fringes of Liverpool and supported Everton, and then he went off to run Manchester, which but yes, you can always tell, is the Labour leader in trouble? Because Burnham, who twice ran and twice lost the leadership, I don't think he entertains any prospect of probably returning, but he sure as hell likes saying, look at me over here, I'm a big beast.
I do have actually one more question, Tim. I went to an event recently and we all had to go around the table and say, it was full of political journalists and writers. Everyone had to predict which cabinet minister they think was the next to go. This was a couple of months ago. Obviously, the Reeves thing has happened now, but it was unanimously Ed Miliband. What would be your prediction?
I think that's wishful thinking, to be honest, on the behalf of the writing class, the political class, half the Labour Party, most of the Conservative Party. Whisper it quietly, but Ed Miliband is quite good in the House of Commons, and he knows what he's trying to do. Not everybody agrees with it. He's trimmed his sails a bit. He's backed some nuclear power plants now. He's very, very popular with the base and with the parliamentary party. I find it difficult to think that if Keir Starmer is doing a reshuffle, either to put people in positions for which they are more suited, or to get rid of Deadwood, or to signal a different direction, it seems pretty unlikely to me that Ed Miliband going forms any part of any of those things. So I would have said Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, who is, I think, even in Downing Street regarded as having made a complete howler of the schools bill, which is undermining some of the academy reforms, which generally regarded as one of the few signal success stories of the Conservative government. I have written repeatedly that people around Starmer would like her to go, and I'm pretty confident that some of the most senior people in Downing Street think she's made a botch of it. They brought in a chap called Ollie de Botton, who used to run an academy school as Starmer's education advisor in Number 10. He's got his head down looking at what to do about all that. But when I wrote that she would be removed in a reshuffle, which I was told very emphatically by several people, Starmer picked up the phone to her and told her that wasn't going to happen. So in the same way that Rachel Reeves looked on, her last legs this week, Starmer, for either cynical reasons or whatever, appears to have told her job's safe. I would think it's very likely she's moved. I think the other one who's vulnerable probably is Lisa Nandy. Team Starmer have never particularly liked Lisa Nandy, and in order to make it easier to get rid of her, there's a lot of talk of them abolishing her department, the Department for Culture, and folding bits of that into the Treasury, particularly into the business department. And that would make it easier to discard a prominent woman by saying, well, we love you, but we just don't think we need your department anymore. So I've also heard that if they kept the department, that's where they might put Bridget Phillipson. So those would be the two I'd keep an eye on. But bluntly, I don't think there'll be a reshuffle until near Christmas, and possibly not until summer of next year. And a lot will happen. A lot of people are going to screw up. A lot of people are going to get agitated and disgruntled and cause trouble for the leadership. I wouldn't, if you're Spectator viewers, if you are having a small bet, I would keep it small.
Well, we would love to hear what the bet is. And we will be covering it all. Tim, so much good insider information. Thank you for joining us.
What a pleasure.